The day Pam Bondi commandeered the courtroom, the massive wooden doors of the Hillsborough County Courthouse creaked open as Pam Bondi walked in. Each step she made rang out in the grand hall, her heels clacking sharply against the gleaming marble floor. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and acrid coffee, a smell that bore the weight of countless courtroom battles waged within these very doors. But this case was different. Pam wasn't just going up against another lawyer. She was going head-to-head with a mighty corporate behemoth charged with fraudulent schemes, a corporation that had deep pockets and an even deeper web of influence. They had hired the best defense money could afford, believing that their reputation would suffocate any opposition. They weren't ready for Pam Bondi. At the front of the courtroom, Judge Richard Calloway presided over his raised bench, shuffling through an intimidating pile of legal papers. His expression was unreadable, but then there it was, a flicker, the merest smirk. Pam knew that look in an instant. Amusement, skepticism, the kind of condescension reserved for lawyers who were too young, too ambitious, or too naive to know what they were getting themselves into. Pam was none of those. She strode toward the plaintiff's table with unshakable confidence, setting down her leather case file with precise deliberation. Across from her, the defense attorney, Charles Merritt, smoothed out his silk tie. He was a man of reputation, old school, plugged in, and above reproach. His successes had been crafted through courtroom melodrama and moneyed alliances. He hardly gave Pam a second look before focusing his attention on the judge, oozing confidence that the case was already his. Next, the courtroom doors opened once again. The jury came in, a blend of men and women of all ages. Some pushed their glasses up their noses, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Their faces were a mix of curiosity and boredom, having no idea they were about to see one of the most surprising reversals in history. Pam Bondi was going to turn it all around. When she was done, Judge Calloway's smirk would disappear, and so would the confidence of the defense. Pam Bondi knew this wouldn't be easy, but she was ready. She didn't merely look at faces, she looked at people. Stories, biases, hopes, doubts. Every juror brought something with them, preconceived notions, quiet skepticism, hidden sympathies. And Pam Bondi had learned a long time ago that the secret to winning a case before a single word was even uttered was understanding those unspoken truths. The bailiff moved forward, his voice firm and steady. All rise. A rustling of movement crowded the courtroom as everyone rose to their feet. At the front, Judge Richard Calloway cleared his throat and adjusted his robe with an air of comfortable authority. "Be seated," he said, nearly dismissively. He poked through his pile of documents before finally lifting his eyes, peering over the top of his glasses. "Miss Bondi, are you ready to go on?" Pam returned his look, her voice steady but firm. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge let out a slow breath through his nose, a hint of amusement in his exhale. "Well, let's hope this doesn't turn into a circus," he muttered, just loud enough for the courtroom microphone to catch it. A few jurors exchanged quick glances. Across the aisle, Charles Merritt smirked. He was used to this, watching young, ambitious attorneys stumble in front of a judge who had already made up his mind. But Pam Bondi? She didn't bat an eye. She opened her case file, flipping calmly through her notes. This wasn't the first time she'd been underestimated in a courtroom, and it wouldn't be the last. But today would be different. Judge Calloway had no idea what was in store. Pam rose to her feet, her voice steady as she spoke to the court. "Your Honor, today's case is about more than legal technicalities. It's about accountability." The judge held up a hand, cutting her off. His expression wavered between amusement and impatience, as if he'd already decided how this hearing would unfold. "Miss Bondi, let's not get ahead of ourselves," he interrupted. "We're here for a preliminary motion, not a grandstanding performance." A quiet ripple of chuckles moved through the courtroom. Pam's expression was impassive. In the corner of the room, Charles Merritt rocked back in his chair, tugging at his cuffs with smug self-assurance. He had watched it happen 100 times before, standing alongside fat-pocketed corporations, making troubles disappear with technical mumbo-jumbo and strategic favors. He was sure today would be no exception. Pam slowly laced her hands behind her back. "Understood, Your Honor." Then she landed the first punch. But the facts speak for themselves. The defendants knowingly misled thousands of people, promising services they never intended to provide. A beat of silence. Judge Calloway let out a sharp breath, thumbing through a case file. "That's a strong accusation, Miss Bondi," he said, his voice neutral but questioning. "One, I assume you can back up?" Pam held his eye without flinching. "I can, and I will." The judge raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "Ah, well," he said. "Let's hear from the defense first, shall we?" He looked at Charles Merritt, already standing up from his chair, flashing an easy, professional smile. "Your Honor," Merritt started, his voice smooth and confident. But for a moment that morning, there was a spark of uncertainty on his face, because Pam Bondi wasn't in court to defend. She was in court to win. The moment the case turned, Charles Merritt stood tall, adjusting his silk tie as he spoke to the court. "This whole case hinges on emotion, not reality." His voice was smooth, trained, the voice of a man who is accustomed to success. "My client, a prominent financial institution, is being as regulated as they ever have been. If some people were deceived, well, that is sad, but certainly not criminal." He waited for a moment, allowing his words to take their time to sink in. Then, with a just right touch of condescension, he went on. "What we have here is another effort to punish a successful business simply because some individuals don't like the way business is done. There is no fraud, no deceit, just a plain misunderstanding that's been unnecessarily blown up to the point of litigation." Silence. Judge Calloway leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly, as if considering Merritt's words carefully. Then, looking at Pam, he released a soft laugh. "Miss Bondi, are we going to waste the court's time on a misunderstanding?" The comment hit like a slap, quick, dismissive. But Pam Bondi? She didn't blink. Instead, she allowed the silence to build, not wanting to be hurried into an answer. The whole courtroom shifted. The jury, the clerks, even Merritt. They all stared at her, waiting. Then, with studied calm, she reached into her file and selected a single document. "No misunderstanding, Your Honor," she told him, voice steady. She stepped towards the bench, heels clicking on the highly polished floor. "Just evidence." She laid the document before him. Judge Calloway corrected his glasses, eyes scanning the page. The smirk disappeared. Just a little bit. Pam turned now, not at the judge, not at Merritt, but at the jury. "What Mr. Merritt refers to as a misunderstanding," she started, "is in fact a pattern, a calculated, intentional plan, intended to trick customers into signing contracts they were never intended to read." She pointed toward the neatly stacked files on her desk. "And I have the evidence." The atmosphere in the room shifted. It was barely perceptible at first, a tensing of posture, a murmur from the jury box. But in that instant, the momentum of the case shifted. Judge Calloway's face grew stern, not laughter, not amusement. Something more like recognition. Pam waited, allowing the silence to land, for everyone in the room to fully take in what had just transpired. The judge, now seriously engrossed, drummed his fingers against the armrest of his chair. Then, at last, he turned to Charles Merritt, the erstwhile smug lawyer now seated a little straighter. "Mr. Merritt," Judge Calloway asked, clearing his throat. And, for the first time that day, Merritt no longer had a smirk in reserve. The moment the defense crumbled, Judge Calloway leaned his head to one side. "I take it you have some explanation for this." For an instant, Charles Merritt wavered. His assurance, so painstakingly cultivated, deserted him. But then, like an actor well-schooled, he adjusted his tie and made himself laugh. "Your Honor, if I may, I do not see how a single document—" Pam was already in motion. Not one. She wheeled around to face her table, her steps deliberate, measured. Then, with a quick movement, she snatched up a pile of neatly bound papers, pages filled with highlighted clauses and footnotes. The weight of the evidence hit the table with a thud. "I have more than 50 contracts here," she said, her voice steady. "Each one almost the same. Each one crafted to trick customers into thinking they were subscribing to low-risk investments." She stopped, her gaze meeting Merritt's, when, in reality, they were signing away their entire world. Merritt prepared to protest, but she was not finished. Pam turned to a page in the first document and held it up for the jury to view. Her voice echoed in the still courtroom. Section 14B says the company reserves the right to vary annual fees by estimated market trends. She let the words linger. Sounds innocent, doesn't it? A rhetorical question, because she already knew the response. Except that in practice, those market trends are established internally, out of sight of oversight, letting the company increase rates at will without warning customers until it's too late. She turned the page. Section 22C. Customers who attempt to withdraw their funds early are subjected to administrative penalties. She glanced at the jury. Vague, right? That's intentional. In reality, those penalties exceed the amount of their actual investment, leaving them with nothing. She turned another page. Section 31A. The company explicitly denies liability for market-driven losses. Pam let out a slow breath, shaking her head. But what this clause doesn't say, what my clients weren't told, is that their money was never actually invested in the market. She stepped forward. Rather, they were directed into riskier private ventures that enriched company executives, while keeping the customers in the dark. Silence. Heavy, uncomfortable, unshakable. Then she placed the document on the desk. This isn't business. This is theft. For the first time that morning, Judge Calloway no longer smiled. He leaned forward a little, fingers interlaced, eyes keen. Pam stared him down. "Now, Your Honor," she went on, her tone icy and measured, "I'm more than willing to argue the technical definitions of fraud and deceptive trade practices all day long, but what I won't stand for, what I won't accept, is my clients being reduced to individuals who simply misunderstood what they were signing." She paused, letting that hang. Then she struck the final blow. "The only misread here is that this firm believed it could pull this off forever." Merritt crossed his legs, his smirk dissipated, his fingers fluttered, smoothing out his cuffs. "Your Honor," he began, his tone suddenly strained, "I move to dismiss said claims on grounds of—" Pam would not let him speak. "Before Mr. Merritt can continue," she said smoothly, "I would like to produce one additional exhibit." She returned to her files, pulled out one page, held it aloft for the room to view, a leaked internal memo, and suddenly the case was finished before Merritt knew it. The moment everything changed. Pam held out the document to the bailiff, her face a mask. He took it, walking up to Judge Calloway. The judge only glanced at it before his jaw visibly clenched. That was all Pam needed. She faced the jury again, making eye contact with every single one of them. This document, sourced from a whistleblower, demonstrates that the executives at this company were well aware of their manipulations, not for months, not for a year, but for more than 5 years. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Pam's voice did not falter. "And it gets worse. The memo specifically tells employees to, and I quote, delay disclosures for as long as legally possible." She paused, allowing the words to sink in. She no longer saw faces in the jury box. She saw expressions: disgust, shock, anger. She turned to Judge Calloway. "Your Honor, this isn't a misunderstanding. This is a company that knew exactly what it was doing, and fully expected the legal system to protect them." The judge huffed hard through his nostrils. His smirk, his disdain, had been gone long enough. Unspoken silence pooled in the room, thick and unbreakable. Judge Calloway's gaze rested on the memo, his hand crushing the paper, grasping something he'd not anticipated coming to terms with. Across the courtroom, Charles Merritt did seem genuinely perturbed for the first time. His customary haughtiness, his smarmy confidence, his easy sidestepping had broken down. He huffed, imposing a stiff, forced smile. "Your Honor," he started, "this alleged memo is nothing but an unsubstantiated document. Its validity is doubtful at best, and even if it were valid, it is not evidence of misconduct. We can't let—" Pam didn't let him continue. "Your Honor," she interjected, her voice sharper now, "this document was obtained directly from a former employee of the defendant's firm. Not only did they confirm its legitimacy," she stepped forward, lifting another file, "but they also provided email chains where executives openly discuss these fraudulent tactics." She handed the second file to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. "These emails are dated, time-stamped, and drawn directly from internal servers." Judge Calloway thumbed through the pages, his face set in a stern expression. At the far end of the room, Merritt's chair scraped against the gleaming floor as he leapt to his feet. "Objection! Overruled!" the judge interrupted, his tone abruptly cold. He placed the documents on the desk, his eyes glinting cold and piercing at Merritt. "Mr. Merritt, do you have a real legal argument, or are you simply here to waste my time?" Merritt's mouth dropped open, but no words escaped. The switch had occurred. The control in the room had shifted. Pam could sense it. She drew a slow, deep breath before she faced the jury again. For years, this company has been hiding behind fine print and vagueness, knowing that the individuals who were signing those contracts didn't have the legal know-how to push back. She looked around the room. They bet on confusion, on intimidation, and above all, on doubt. She paused on the word. Some of the jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces strained. Pam edged forward, but today, a moment of silence. Then quietly and firmly, "That doubt is gone." The moment, the courtroom changed forever. Pam's voice didn't falter, because now we have proof. She turned, striding slowly towards the jury, her presence filling the room, evidence that they knew precisely what they were doing, evidence that their intention was never in good business, but fraud. She spun back to the judge, her eyes fixed on him. "And if this court lets them get away from this, then we aren't just failing my clients. We are informing every corporation in America that they can do the same, that they can cheat hard-working people, and the legal system will turn a blind eye." A shiver ran through the jury box. A woman in the front row, who had remained expressionless for most of the hearing, pressed her lips together. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. Pam had them. Across the bench, Judge Calloway tapped his fingers on the desk, this time slower, more deliberate. Then his gaze shifted to Charles Merritt. "Mr. Merritt," the judge said, his tone unreadable, "do you have any response to this evidence? Anything at all?" Merritt hesitated. For the first time, his usual tricks, his charm, his bluffs, his polished courtroom theatrics were useless, and everyone knew it. The jury, the gallery, even the court reporters had stopped typing, waiting, watching. Merritt swallowed hard. He adjusted his tie. Finally, he sat back down. "No, Your Honor," he muttered. The entire room felt the weight of those 3 words. Judge Calloway leaned back in his chair, studying him for a long moment. Then his gaze shifted to Pam, and for the first time his face wasn't exactly amusement. It was something else, something more like respect. "Proceed, Miss Bondi." The courtroom stopped laughing. Pam took a slow breath, calming herself down. She'd spent years sitting in courtrooms like this, standing up against men like Charles Merritt, standing up against judges like Calloway, standing up against corporations who believed their money granted them immunity. But at the moment, right now, she wasn't just another lawyer making her argument. She was the sole individual in the room with complete command of the story, and she wasn't going to squander it. She faced the jury, her eyes unblinking. What is next is in the hands of this court. She let them digest it. Then she raised a hand, pointing towards the rear of the room. "But first, I want you to see what's actually at risk here." The jurors looked in her direction. Behind her sat her clients, not executives, not lawyers, not power brokers, ordinary people, most of them elderly, some with furrowed brows, others clasping their hands together, holding on to the last thread of hope they had. Pam moved in closer to the jury box, her voice steady but strong. "These are not just figures on a spreadsheet." She gazed at each juror. "These are retirees who lost their life savings, parents who had to get second jobs just in order to stay in their homes, small business owners who were instructed to have faith in a system that never had their backs." She allowed the silence to linger in the air, heavy with the realness of it all. And then she struck the final blow. The question isn't whether the law is on their side. She took another step closer. The question is, will you be? The room was silent. Nobody moved. No one breathed. And in that instant, Pam Bondi knew she had already won. The moment justice became inevitable, Pam's voice fell low and steady. They trusted a system that was designed to work against them. She paused in front of the jury, lowering her voice just enough so that they had to lean in to hear. Executives of the company sat in boardrooms, sipping pricey coffee, deliberating just how much they could push individuals before they rebelled. She hesitated, looking around the room. They relied on silence. They relied on fear. And they relied on attorneys like Charles Merritt to persuade courts like this one that fraud is business as usual. A quick, deliberate shift. Her eyes settled on Merritt for a fleeting moment. Then she addressed the judge once more. "Your Honor, the defense would have you think this was a miscommunication, that my clients just plain didn't read the fine print." A moment of silence. "But the truth is, the fine print was intended to ensnare them." Her voice wasn't raised. It didn't have to be. It was a trap dressed up as a contract. And once they signed, the door shut. She backed away, allowing the words to linger. Then, slow and intentional, she put her hands on the plaintiff's table. Her gaze bore into Judge Calloway, and she struck the final blow. The only question now is whether this court is willing to let them get away with it. Silence. Absolute. Unshakable. For the first time, Judge Calloway did not reach for his gavel. He didn't make another joke. He didn't smirk. He just sat there, glaring at the papers before him, as if he were looking at them for the first time. The jury didn't budge either. Some looked down at the contracts before them, others at Pam's clients, their faces changing, from doubt to something else. Anger, perhaps, or something more. A sense of obligation. Pam breathed softly. She had done what she was here to do. Then Judge Calloway spoke. "Mr. Merritt," he said, his voice considerably heavier than previously. "Upon examination of this evidence, I find no cause for dismissal." Merritt's face hardened. "Your Honor, The judge held up a hand. "No." His tone was stronger now, unyielding. "Your client will address these charges in full trial." He looked at Pam. "Miss Bondi, your motion to proceed is granted." Pam did not smile, did not gloat. She simply nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." But Charles Merritt knew. So did the jury. So did the gallery. Pam Bondi had just won the battle, before the war had even started. Judge Calloway leaned back in his chair, massaging his chin. His smirk from before, gone, replaced by something more serious, something begrudging. A judge who had come into this hearing anticipating an open and shut case, now found himself gazing at the very real possibility that he had misjudged everything. Pam Bondi stood firm, unwavering, because she wasn't here seeking approval. She was here seeking justice, and she wasn't leaving without it. The shift no one saw coming. Pam wasn't here to soak in the moment. She had done what she set out to do, forced the court to pay attention to this case. Charles Merritt, however, had turned white. His knuckles were white on the edges of his legal pad. His fingers clutched them tightly, but he knew there was nothing more to say, no loopholes to fall through, no legal moves to hide the truth behind reams of paperwork. Judge Calloway sighed, slow, deliberate, then spoke to the court reporter. "Let the record reflect that the defense motion for dismissal has been denied. This case will go to trial." A hush ran through the gallery. Pam did not respond, but she did feel it. The atmosphere in the room had changed irrevocably. Judge Calloway gazed back at her, and for the very first time, there was no smirk on his face, no amusement, no condescension, just a look of dawning realization that he had miscalculated, and worse, that he had let himself be manipulated by the very individuals she was battling. He adjusted his robe, cleared his throat. Then he spoke directly to her. "Miss Bondi," he said, his voice quieter than before, "you've built a compelling case here today." Pam simply nodded. "That was the goal, Your Honor." A pause. Then Calloway glanced at the documents one last time, before shifting his gaze to Charles Merritt. "I strongly advise your client to reconsider their position before trial." His voice carried an edge that hadn't been there before. "Because based on what I've seen today, I think they might not like the result." Merritt's jaw tightened. He knew precisely what that was. His client could have billions, but money didn't alter facts. And now, the court was listening. Pam turned, gathering her files. Her movements were calculated, professional. No time to celebrate yet. This was just the start. But as she looked up, she caught something surprising. The judge gave her a little nod. Not an apology, not an admission, but something close. Something that said to her, he saw her now, and so did the rest of them, but a nod of respect. Pam had pushed a system that too often worked in favor of the powerful to admit that today it had finally met its match. She exited the courtroom with the same purposeful stride she had entered with. No hurry, no hesitation, no need to glance back. She had done what she was there to do. And now, it was the system's turn to do its part. Outside, the air was heavy with the hum of reporters. Cameras flashed. Microphones were thrust in her direction. "Miss Bondi, what do you think of today's decision? What's your plan now? Do you think the company will settle out of court?" Pam didn't break stride. This wasn't a time for press conferences and sound bites. Instead, she turned to where her clients stood. Men and women who had been overlooked, dismissed and exploited for too long. A woman in her 60s, with a faded blue cardigan, stepped forward tentatively. Her voice was soft but unyielding. "Does this mean we have a chance?" Pam looked at her, and for the first time that day permitted herself a small smile. "Yes," she replied briefly. "You do." The woman clapped a hand to her mouth, her eyes shining with relief. A few others said their thanks in hushed tones, some nodding only, too stunned to speak. Pam didn't need applause. She didn't need recognition. This was why she did what she did, to give people back what had been stolen from them. Behind her, Charles Merritt came out of the courthouse, his usual confidence replaced by something colder. He avoided her eye, drew out his phone, stalked towards a black town car. Pam knew exactly what was happening. His clients were already calling, already panicking, already preparing for damage control. Good. Judge Calloway's ruling didn't guarantee victory, but it sent a message. People were watching now. The powerful weren't invincible, and no amount of legal sleight of hand could wash away the truth forever. Pam faced her clients again. "This isn't over," she said to them. "Not yet, but today you made them listen, and that's where real change begins." The woman in the cardigan nodded, clasping Pam's hand tightly for a moment, then disappearing back into the crowd. Pam glanced once more at the courthouse, then breathed out, already planning the work to come. Justice wasn't about winning one battle. It was about never forgetting the fight, and that was a battle